He has also won multiple Webby and Best Podcast Awards, and his books have been translated into 28 languages. So it is a pleasure for us to continue our afternoon session with Scott Galloway.
Good afternoon, I'm Taylor Swift. They always put me, the good news about being, I'm good at this. I'm a really good speaker, just so I can set an impossible to hit benchmark. That's the good news. The bad news is they always put you at the end of the conference trying to get people to stick around. So I'm the last thing between you and alcohol in the airport right now. I generally find people are just grumpy by the time I get on stage. All right, we're gonna talk about AI. I'm generally an AI optimist, and I'm going to take you through a series of observations of trying to find what is AI. I do think it's a bit of a bubble, but the question is how big will the pop be and who gets kind of taken by the strafe or the shrapnel. What is AI washing and what seems to be real, how it affects the consumer age. I'm going to talk a little bit about the risks and the fact that I think we're studying to the wrong test here. Okay, what is AI? Oh shit, you've probably heard this about 12 times. I'm gonna skip through this. But the input is we're creating data. As we're just stuck to our phones, all we're doing is creating all this digital exhaust, and that's essentially the coal in the furnace for driving this thing, right? So the companies with the most access to raw data are the ones that have sort of the most oil, if you will, and we're creating, everything you're doing right now, or almost everything you're doing on your phone, is creating a data set. And remember, I've been a consultant my whole life, and we always used to say data is the new oil, right? Data is everything. Well, if data is the new oil, we're literally drowning in it. And that is, data is everywhere. If you go into a company and you ask them how they need help, they have data everywhere. It's not data sources they're lacking for. What they're lacking is, to use the metaphor, refining capability that turns that data into an actionable insight, right? And that's where kind of AI comes in. And that is, I like to use retail analogies. So the majority of shareholder value added in retail through the 70s, 80s, and 90s was big box retailers, Sears, JCPenney, then obviously Walmart. And the basic idea there was massive selection, lowest price, right? Selection was seen as a feature, not a bug. And that's what Google is. It'll get you 55,000 results in 0.0055 seconds, right? And then through the 2000s, a new type of retailer added the most shareholder value. And it was one that said, no, choice is a mistake. Consumers don't want more choice. They want to be more confident in the choices presented. So we're not going to give you 22 different toasters. We're going to give you 3, good, better, and best, from someone in San Francisco who has much better taste in kitchen electronics than you. That's Williams Sonoma. We're not going to give you every yoga pant. We have someone with much better taste than you in athleisure, living in Vancouver, and we're only going to give you 2 or 3 choices. That's Lululemon. So essentially the value add was saying, you know what, we know better than you, and we're going to limit your choice. And that's effectively what AI is. AI says, okay, there's Walmart, Google, that gives you everything. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a bunch of information and intelligent-like or human-like intelligence, and we're going to do our best to give you the one best answer. And that adds a lot of value. There's a certain confidence in DOPA release when you type into AI a question or a query, and it says, you know what? I think I can give you the best answer, the best one answer, right? I don't give you thousands, because there's a lot of calorie burn sorting through all the crap on the Google homepages, especially as Google has tried to grow shareholder value and is no longer taking you to the best place, but it's taking you to another place they can further monetize. If you want to build a $1 trillion market cap company, and I always think it's a good idea for a one-person company to say, how might this someday evolve to a $1 trillion company? The one thing that these multi-trillion-dollar companies have in common almost always is at the end of the day, they're time machines. And that is, they give us back time. So if you only shop on Amazon Grocery, you save somewhere between 2 and 9 days in a grocery store. If you only let your kids watch Netflix versus ad-supported television, that kid literally saves 9 days of watching commercials a year if you have non-ad-supported viewing. ChatGPT, again, I think is reducing the amount of time and saying, again, we can pick the best toaster. So what I do is I say, all right, I try to be as honest as possible, right? In sum, wherever I am, I aspire to be the oldest, least cool person in the room. And I achieve that a lot in New York. But I'll be very honest about what I'm looking for, and it'll come back with where I should go. And I trust it. I don't want to go cool nightlife into Google and get 40,000 different selections. I want something that I think is smarter than me to use human-like intelligence to go, Scott. So the bad news is I'm in the midst of a midlife crisis. The good news is I think I'm going to grow out of it in about 30 or 40 years. And it says, all right, you should hang at Casa Cipriani. Meh. Okay. I need a playlist for my party tonight. I need something, I need processing power with the confidence that whatever it spits back at me, I'll feel like it's a good party list. Now, this isn't a great query because what I should be saying is my 15-year-old's having a Halloween party, so I want something fun and contemporary that doesn't feel like Dad put it together. You know, the more information you give it, the better the answer. That's what my graphics team did this morning. What did you do? The best consumer example, I think, of AI is TikTok. And that is, and I love this stat, consumers spend 2.5 hours a week trying to figure out what to eat, and they spend almost an hour a week. US households spend almost 1 hour a week, or a week a year, deciding what to watch on Netflix. And for any of you who have kids, you know this experience, right? Let's watch Netflix. All right, we got the popcorn, you sit down, and the arguments start. TikTok is basically AI, and it says, using signal liquidity based on how long you watch something, whether you go to the creator site, if you watch the full thing, how fast you go by it, thumbs up, thumbs down. We're going to calibrate using all that signal liquidity, and we're going to give you not 11,000 hours of video content Netflix to choose from or sort through. We're going to give you the one streaming media program we know you'll love. That's really the beauty and the value proposition of TikTok, is it uses AI to reduce your choice to one thing. By the way, it is just insane that we would let the CCP, an adversary, implant a neural jack into the wet matter of tomorrow's military, business, nonprofit, and civic leader. This is the ultimate propaganda tool, and we've decided to let our young people spend more time on TikTok every day than adults spent on CBS, NBC, and ABC in the 60s. Would we have been down during the Cold War with Russia owning CBS, NBC, and ABC? That's what we've opted for by letting TikTok continue to be the ultimate propaganda tool in the US. Absolutely makes no fucking sense we haven't banned this thing. But oh my God, do I love me some TikTok. It's figured me out so perfectly. I love to watch really boring shit from economists. I love to watch things about Great Danes. I have a Great Dane. I am fascinated by watching chiropractors aggressively adjust people. I'm like, here it comes. She's got neck pain. What's he doing? He's telling, oh my God! And now she can walk. I just absolutely love it. And I also love watching people talk about social justice issues who happen to be also ridiculously hot. And I'm like, oh my God, income inequality. Come on, it's late. All right, where are we? Okay, so one of my economic role models, Paul Krugman, talks about productivity isn't everything, but it's almost everything. And if you look at what's happened, I just met some Europeans backstage. I'm living in London. Effectively, the rise of China hasn't come at the cost of the US. We have the same proportion globally of the billionaires, or representative billionaires in the US, unicorns. Who it's really come at the cost of is Europe. Europe has really struggled the last 30 years economically. We were at parity with Europe in terms of productivity per hour. Our workers, their workers, were creating about $47 an hour output. Since then, we've pulled way ahead, 30% greater, mostly through a leverage. Some people would argue deregulation, other people would argue our great universities. I think it's mostly that we've been better at kind of leveraging technology. In addition, look at this. Say you're want to retire and you've been contributing to your FTSE or Bolsa index retirement fund. In the last 30 years, right, you're up 160% or 2.6-fold in 3 years, which isn't a lot, and 30 years, which isn't a lot. Whereas if you were working for an American company and contributing to your 401k, you have 11 times your money. So the level of prosperity recognized in the US relative to Europe is dramatic. Now, there's some nuance there in that what William Gibson said about technology is also true with prosperity in the US, and that it's here, but it's just not evenly distributed, right? The top 10% have probably grown their wealth 20 to 30x, and the bottom 10% are probably just maybe up 1 or 2-fold. So the bottom kind of quartile of America looks more like the prosperity recognized in Europe, and the top 10%, there's just nothing like it in the history of mankind. Effectively, America, and both political parties have agreed on this, is that we've decided that America has kind of become the Hunger Games, and that is the bottom 90% of America have kind of become nutrition and are there to be optimized for the top 10%. And you think, well, how do we let that happen? America's superpower is its optimism, but the Achilles heel of that optimism is all of us believe we and our kids will be in that top 10%. And so we're willing to engage in a series of policies that continue to extract wealth and opportunity from the bottom 90 into the top 10, because the majority of us think that we're going to be in the top 10. And I can prove to every one of us that 9 out of 10 of our children are not going to be in the top 10%. That's my socialist rant. So what do you have here? You have what should be an increase in productivity, but even in the US, productivity has become somewhat stagnant. Now, I would argue that the culprit here, or one of the culprits, our taxes are too low, specifically corporate taxes, which are the lowest they've been since 1939. And that is, corporations have a memory, and they say, well, if we push $1 out to our shareholders in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even portion of the 90s, we lose 60 cents, 50 cents, 40 cents, because corporate taxes are 40, 50, 60 cents on the dollar. But now the corporate taxes are the lowest they've been since 1939. Most companies, with some rare exceptions, specifically the Magnificent 10, most companies are pushing more and more money out to shareholders. So the bar for internal investment gets higher and higher and higher, because essentially they're not going to lose it. If you have a 50% corporate tax rate, that means that every dollar you reinvest in the company and in growth, new employees, new management, that you're essentially getting a 50% credit on it, because otherwise it would be, you would lose 50 cents of it distributing it outside to shareholders. Now, the ancillary to that, or the exception to that, is the Magnificent 10, that are essentially making these extraordinary CapEx investments, because the market, every time they say, oh, we just signed a deal with Oracle to commit to $300 billion in compute purchases, the market takes the stock up, because they go, well, Sam Altman must know something we don't, and if he's willing to sign a contract for $300 billion, by the way, that's total bullshit. I'm sure it's similar to a Trump tariff deal. It's a framework. There's no way. This company making $15 billion run rate maybe can commit contractually to a $300 billion compute contract. That is kind of, I think, a false flag or a signal to say, my business is so amazing that I'm signing up for a $300 billion vendor contract. We'll see. Also, innovation is kind of taken on different forms. True story, my first job was at Morgan Stanley right out of UCLA, and they asked me to go to London, and I got on the Concorde. But the problem is it didn't take off. I got on, and there was a maintenance delay, and we had to get off, and I just went over in a typical aircraft. The Concorde actually, if you factored in maintenance delays and flight cancellations, took longer to get across the Atlantic than traditional planes. And now, today, it takes longer to get from New York to Dallas commercially than it did 50 years ago, because of optimization for shareholder value. They're slowing planes down, obviously air traffic control, and obviously we have such government dysfunction. We're now a third world nation. Good luck getting home, folks. I didn't have lunch. I'm like especially pissed off right now. Okay. So essentially, electricity was probably the greatest innovation in terms of technology, right? I would argue maybe the American middle class, right? Bringing 7 million men home from war. They had demonstrated heroism, they looked good, they were fit, and then we stuffed a bunch of money into their pocket. We distributed income to give them education, FHA loans, and we made a series of 7 million middle-class men attractive. Attractive enough such that women would want to mate with them. And true story. By the way, fun fact throughout history, 80% of women have reproduced, only 40% of men. The true natural order of our species is that a small number of men can engage in what I would call portia polygamy, and that is to have a disproportionate number of mates. And unless you consciously redistribute from the wealthiest back to the middle class, a small number of men have all the mating opportunities, and the lower 90 get enraged, and we invent wars and violence for them. That has almost nothing to do with AI. Get him something to eat. Who invited this guy? Okay, so we saw an increase in productivity of electricity of 1.3%, annual GDP, internet almost 1%, and so far the anticipated growth from AI looks like it's going to be almost on par with the internet. And we've seen an explosion in patents. And my secret weapon for trying to predict whether or not a technology is going to be sustainable is I look at peer-reviewed academic research. And if you look at the research on AI, it mimics the research trajectory of GPS, which I think is the most seminal technology of the last 40 or 50 years, arguably, in terms of creating shareholder value. So it looks like AI is sort of here to stay. Whereas if you look at peer-reviewed academic research around crypto or VR, it goes wham, and then it goes away almost as fast as it popped up. Whereas the build around AI looks like the curve around GPS. It looks like a kind of a sustained increasing wave. I think the most exciting, if I was just an economic animal, someone asked me last night, I'm on a book tour, I just released a book, and someone asked me, very thoughtfully, what's your purpose? I love that. By the way, I heard Brene Brown was here earlier. Hold me, Brene. And I like Brene. I have her on my podcast. It's free fucking therapy. Was your father not nice to you? He left me when I was 8 for a stewardess at Continental Airlines. Hold my hands, Brene. True story. Where are we? Okay. My purpose up until the age of 40, I just wanted to be rich. I grew up with not a lot of money, raised by a single immigrant mother who lived and died a secretary. I didn't want to save the whales. I didn't want to be a social justice warrior. I wanted bank. And if I were me now and just focused on economic security, I would try and find a job at the intersection between AI and healthcare. Healthcare is the most disruptible business in the history of the planet. We spend $2 trillion on healthcare, $13,000 per person in the US, such that we can be obese, anxious, and die sooner than the rest of the G7, which spends $6,500 per consumer and lives longer and is happier. Why? Because we've monetized Americans' healthcare. We take the industrial food complex that wants to get you addicted to sugary, fatty, shitty food, and then we hand you over to the industrial medical complex that wants to make money off of high blood pressure medication, statins, knee, hip replacements, kidney dialysis. In sum, there's money in how obese you are. And now 70% of Americans are either overweight or obese. And we're trying to convince people who are overweight that they're finding their truth. No, you're not. You're finding a fucking ventilator. A lot of AI approved medical devices. It's a good segue. Okay, you want to talk about a fragile economy right now? What is America? America right now is a giant bet on AI. A giant bet. Do you realize without these 10 companies, all connected to AI, GDP growth would be flat, and then the markets would likely be down? 77% of earnings growth from the entire S&P 500 was represented by just 10 companies. I believe it's the reason that the current administration has cloud cover to send a secret police masked force into cities and nationalize the National Guard against its own citizens, because as long as the S&P is up 16%, we assume everything's fine and what the administration is doing is okay. If these 10 companies had gone down in value and we had negative S&P and negative GDP growth, I don't think there's any way the administration would have cloud cover to be doing the kind of things they're doing. America right now is an enormous singular bet on AI. These 10 companies in the S&P 500 now represent 40% of the total S&P by market value, which represents half of the total value of the global equity market. In sum, 10 companies now represent 20% of global equity value. If these companies sneeze, the whole global economy is going to get severe pneumonia. So the best performing companies, sort of all related to AI or the infrastructure around AI. These 4 companies used to be 4% of the stock market. Now they're 18. These are the companies, my first book was called The Four, basically an examination of these companies. And then, as we said, they represent 40% of the S&P. The NASDAQ, what do they call it? The NASDAQ's killing it? No, it's not. The NASDAQ's flat. It's 10 companies that are dragging the entire markets up with it. How have your stocks done? Well, if you're in an index fund, you're fine because 40% of your index fund is invested in these companies because they're weighted. But if you, like many people, think you're smarter than your average bear and can actually engage in stock picking, by the way, spoiler alert, you can't. But if you pick stocks, I can tell you how you're doing. I just list 10 names and ask you if you have any of them. What's interesting is that when guys like me say it's a bubble, it usually means the market's about to double. And that is, the economists called the dot-com implosion perfectly, how it would lay out, the destruction in capital. But they called it in 1997, and the NASDAQ doubled between that and 1999. Now granted, Amazon and Cisco lost 90% of their value between 1999 and 2001, but one of them came ripping back. Every company you can think of that's considered a tech darling, whether it's Tesla, whether it's Apple, whether it's Netflix. People forget, just 3 years ago, Netflix lost 70% of its value. Apple lost 50% of its value in 2022. There is no big tech company that at some point hasn't had a 12-month period where it's down somewhere between 50 and 70%. Meta, an unbelievable company, lost 2/3 of its value in 2023, because remember when Apple kneecapped them by not letting them target people, and the stupid investments in VR where Zuckerberg envisioned a legless future for all of us, and the company lost almost 70% of its value. So the fear is that if these companies lose 70% of their value in a 12-month period, which happens to every tech company in history to date, that kind of destruction in value, NVIDIA alone, if it loses 70% of its value, would shed the value of the German GDP. I mean, that's not true. The German stock market, excuse me. There's no kind of like holding on for dear life if these companies go down 50, 60, 70%. Why? Because not only are we overly concentrated in these companies, we're overly concentrated in a certain number of consumers. The top 10% of income-earning households in the United States represent now 50% of the consumer spend. And you go, well, that's great, the rich people are spending all their money and driving a lot of the economy. The hard part is that when 1 in 10 people are responsible for 50% of the consumer economy, that creates a very fragile economy. And those people spend money based on one thing, their confidence as evidenced by how much their stock portfolio is worth when they look at their phone 12 times a day as I do, right? Oh, I can afford a second car. Oh, I can afford to go to St. Bart's, right? And the dangerous part is if the economy or these companies go down, wealthy people can cut their discretionary spend by 30, 50, 80%. Middle class and lower income homes can't cut their discretionary spend that much because quite frankly, they don't have that much. So we are especially fragile right now. Essentially, the entire economy, and I would argue the global economy, is really riding on the prospects of just 10 companies, which typically over economic history have periods where the drawdown is 1/2 to 2/3 of their value. Okay, so to be fair though, if this is a bubble, the balloon isn't quite as inflated. Dot-coms got to, on average, 52 times earnings. The Magnificent Seven are only trading at 27 because their earnings growth has been almost as dramatic as their market cap valuation growth. It has really strange knock-on effects. So the acquisition of Paramount Essentially, the only people in media now are Nepo babies, because the prices being paid for these trophy assets and the opportunity to go to the Academy Awards, the only people who can afford them are essentially the children of billionaires. So Sherry Redstone sells Paramount, by the way, daughter of a billionaire, and it's purchased by this kid named David Ellison, whose father increased his net worth by $93 billion when they announced that framework for a $300 billion in compute contract from OpenAI. And now he's decided to bid for Warner Brothers Discovery. And I mean, when you think about how impactful CNN and all of these networks and Warner Brothers and HBO are on society, and the fact that one earnings call in one day can take his wealth up so much that his son can start bidding on the majority of content assets in the United States, it gives you a sense for just the scale of the wealth creation that's being derived from artificial intelligence-related companies right now. This is a crazy stat. Next year, we're going to spend more money building data centers than new office buildings. So more money is going to be spent on buildings that can be dark during the day because there are no humans inside them versus any new office buildings. That's just staggering when you think about how the economy is reshaping, that essentially AI is the tail wagging the dog of economy, if you will. Now, there's the graphic. Nobody wants to invest in actual assets anymore, right? The ultimate business model is to create a thin layer of innovation or a thick layer of innovation on top of other people's CapEx. Airbnb, don't be in the business of owning things, right? Be in the business of renting out other people's apartments or homes. Uber, we don't want to own the car. We don't want to be in charge of maintenance and keeping these things up, so create a layer of innovation on top of other people's assets. They think that electricity consumption, that essentially data centers are going to require almost as much incremental electricity demand is required now by the state of California. OpenAI is projecting that they're going to need the equivalent of 250 nuclear power plants to power their LLMs. I think some of this is BS, like trying to manifest the future by saying this is how big my company is going to be, but still, the demands on the grid could be extraordinary. Okay. And it looks like our electric bills are going up. The result is energy companies, it's not easy to spin up a utility, right? So you have constriction or a lag in supply, you have a huge spike in demand that looks sustained. So the subsequent stock prices of publicly traded energy companies have gone crazy because the market perceives they're going to have a ton of margin power. I don't know how many of you, I spend all of my money on travel. And I don't own a car, but I love to travel well. I travel to hotels, not to cities. I just met a woman from Madrid, and I'm like, it's not Madrid for me, it's the Rosewood Villa Magna. I travel to hotels, I don't travel to cities. And the thing I've noticed about high-end hotels, which take 10, 12 years to spin up, is that because coming out of COVID, the wealthy got very, very wealthy. And because there's sort of a, you only live once and probably a healthier sense of mortality that we all live, luxury travel has just skyrocketed. And the inflation, and no one feels sorry for anybody, but the inflation of 5- and 6-star hotels is up about 140% since COVID. I think the same, because you can't, what you want to be in an industry where it's hard to spin up supply and see spikes in demand. That's the ultimate position to be in as a manager, such you can claim it's your genius. Okay. China will add, in the first half of 25, more solar energy capacity than the rest of the world combined. It's just hilarious that we get angry at China for being this big polluter, which they are, but at the same time, they're adding more kind of renewable energy this year than the rest of the world. So the first thing you should do when you get out of here, if you learn anything, is go to your LinkedIn profile and figure out a way to add the term AI at least 3 times to your LinkedIn profile. True story. If you have AI, the term AI, 3 or more times in your LinkedIn profile, you're 40% more likely to be scraped and recommended by a HR bot trying to identify candidates for a hiring manager. Everybody wants someone with quote-unquote AI domain expertise or background. And now companies that mention the term AI in their earnings call on average see a bump of 4.6%. If you don't mention AI in your earnings call, you get an average bump of 2.4%. So even companies like PepsiCo are talking about AI over and over again. I call it the Sydney Sweeney effect. I love that her being in an ad campaign sends American Eagle stock up 25%. And then as you can see, the number of companies mentioning AI or trying to reposition their companies somehow as AI companies is just extraordinary. And then now you can have AI-inspired energy drinks or a toothbrush run on AI, right? Samsung has a whole line of AI-inspired appliances. So there's a lot of AI washing going on right now. It reminds me of the 90s or late 90s. Williams-Sonoma was called williamssonoma.com for a while. A lot of companies actually changed their name to .com as a suffix. Now, here's some cold water. According to a recent MIT study, and a lot of academics have said that the logic is faulty, but directionally I think you would have to admit that it's probably says something kind of frightening. According to this study of the surveyed organizations, 95% of these organizations said they were not getting the anticipated ROI they'd hoped for so far from their investments in AI. And that is, there seems to be a lag. There's no lag in companies deciding that AI is the future and making huge expenditures on LLM and site licenses. What's taking longer than they'd anticipated is companies, or is that their labor force actually adopting them. I think this is a few things. One, I don't think anyone's in a hurry to use new technologies, especially if they think they're sharpening the sword that's going to be their executioner. Hey, I've just found, you're not going to believe this, I've just leveraged this new technology and you no longer need me. The day that report came out, the market reacted. So another, I think, interesting analogy of AI, every year I do a predictions deck where I predict social and technological and market trends for the following year. And I've been doing it for almost 10 years. And I do it at the end of November, I'll do it this year. And in 23 and 24, or my predictions for 23 and 24, I said AI twice. That was the first time I had back-to-back. My technology of the year for 25 wasn't AI. I think the technology that's going to have a bigger impact on a ground level and on the economy, like the real economy, and a bigger impact on the people sitting in this room, is not GPT-5, it's GLP-1. I think essentially semaglutides are more impactful on the economy and people's real world lives than AI is going to be. And what AI I would describe as its corporate Ozempic. Now, what do I mean by that? I've sat on 7 public company boards, probably a couple dozen private company boards, and something very strange has happened in the last 2 years, and that is typically what happens is a CEO will come in and say, I'm planning to grow revenues by 12%, and I need approval for this CapEx. Based on a growth of 12%, I need to hire another 7 or 8% employees, which will take our earnings up 15%. That sounds like a really good board meeting, by the way. Or we're having a tough year, I see revenues going down 3%, I'm gonna need to lay off 5% of our workforce. So the idea is that when you're growing, you need to keep beating calories in the form of hiring. 3 earnings calls ago, Meta had what I would argue is one of the most seminal earnings calls in business history, and that is Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO, said we grew revenues 23%. Meanwhile, we did it with 20% fewer employees. That's never happened before. If he'd announced on the earnings call, we have laid off 20% of our staff, analysts would have freaked out and started hitting sell. That means he's about to announce a really shitty quarter, but he didn't. And what you have now in boardrooms is people are asking, how do we get the great taste of earnings growth without the calories of hiring more people? And that's what a semaglutide does. Since we came off the savannah thousands of years ago, there was an absence of salty, sugary, fatty food, an absence of mating opportunities, an absence of free, safe play. And as a result, our instincts haven't caught up to industrial production of these things. So we get addicted to food, we get addicted to gambling, we get addicted to porn, because we're just not used to, when you have food in front of you for 99% of our time on this planet, it was like, eat it all now because you don't know when you're going to have access to it again. But essentially what AI does is it says, you know what, like a semaglutide, you may not need to keep eating/hiring. And the conversation happening in board meetings that people don't want to talk about is, can we continue to grow with fewer employees? And what's interesting is the greatest labor destruction is actually logically coming from, but when I heard this, it just seemed so obvious, it felt like really interesting insight. It's happening at the companies that are the early adopters of AI, specifically big tech themselves. And you're seeing 3,000, 10,000, 20,000, I think 30,000 layoffs just announced Amazon corporate. And it makes sense that the companies that are most facile with AI are trying to do more with less. They're saying, switch off the switch in your brain that says you need to eat/hire more. AI is corporate Ozempic. And we don't talk about this out loud a lot because it doesn't make for an inspirational all hands to say, the CEO to say, I've got good news, we're going to grow revenues next year, I've got even great news, I'm going to need fewer of you. And we're starting to see job cuts kind of accelerate. So AI, if you look at the valuations of AI, it's assuming we're going to get $1 trillion in incremental revenues to justify the expenses or cut $1 trillion in costs. I don't see a lot of incremental revenue right now from AI. I don't see new AI moisturizers from L'Oreal or new cars that are AI driven. What I see is companies saying, we're going to spend $10 million less next year on legal, or we figured out a way to cut customer service budget by 50%, or we don't need as many people in our marketing department. So one of two things is going to happen in the next 3 to 4 years. If you think that half the jobs in America, 150 million people work, are immune to AI, that means 75 million are susceptible. $1 trillion in savings is approximately $100,000 fully loaded per employee. That's approximately 10 million jobs. So that's about a 14% destruction of employment across those industries. If that doesn't sound like a lot, that's pure chaos to try and shed 14% of your employee base in an industry over 36 months. Or those companies that I was saying is the global string in the economy, are going to get cut in half or more. One of those things, I don't see any path that doesn't bifurcate into labor destruction, chaos, and information-intensive industries, or these companies' valuation coming down by 50 or 70%. Okay. I'll speed up, I'm taking too long with my bad joke. So supposedly you can save time coding with AI. Who would have known? And it's especially hurting not the senior people, it's especially hurting young employees. I would hate to be a mediocre attorney right now. And no one ever thinks they're mediocre, but on average, most attorneys are average. This blew my mind. One of the sins or punishment for having kids, I have a 15-year-old, and he drags me to the seventh circle of hell called superhero films. And I just went and saw the Fantastic Four, and the thing that blew me away, these are such evil people. They put an Easter egg at the end, so your 15-year-old makes you suffer through the credits. The credits were 7 minutes long, and I went back and I looked at them. This is the number of people to create a really mediocre film. Still not done. These are all different people. This is my favorite. Connie Simmons was a home economist assistant. Finley Lucas was a junior petty cash buyer. Jim Bones was the foam supervisor. There were 23 people doing costume design for their shoot in Sweden. I think when the Ellisons come into the entertainment field, you're going to see an unbelievable destruction in labor in the film industry, where instead of spending $200 million, which they did on this film, they're going to spend $20 million across 10 films and diversify their risk. And they're going to take all of those costs out of the labor component of these films. Almost as many people worked at the Fantastic Four as work at Palantir, and more people worked on this film than work at Lyft or Reddit. Everything's going to get Colbert. So Stephen Colbert, who I think is hugely talented, makes $60 million a year, but he spends $100 million. 200 people work on that show. They have unions, they have a big fancy theater, a band, 200 people, losing 40 million a year. Stephen will go to podcasts. He'll only do 20 million a year in revenue, but it'll only cost 10 million a year, and he'll make more money. The problem is, of the 200 people, maybe 190 will not make it on the podcast arc with Stephen. That is effectively what is happening to a big component of our economy at the hands of AI. So, no joke, I can see why people are excited. These companies have scaled faster than any companies in history. People have tripled the amount of time they're spending on ChatGPT. It's the fastest 0 to 10 billion revenue company in history. Now, in terms of dynamics, ChatGPT kind of owned it. They're losing some share. The big winners have been Google's Gemini. They're getting much better. But also, I think the most interesting one is DeepSeek, which is essentially this near-free LLM out of China. And I believe that OpenAI and Palantir are the most overvalued companies in the world. I would argue the most undervalued company in the world is the company I think should be banned, and that is ByteDance. By the way, only 20% of its revenue comes out of the US. The existential overhang of the insecurity about being banned or not has created a company that is actually worth a lot less now than OpenAI based on its most recent valuation. To give you a sense for what that means, Palantir is valued at 125 times revenue, OpenAI at 39 times revenue. ByteDance, with what I think is literally one of the most addictive technologies in history, is valued at 2 times revenues in the secondary market. I think this is dramatically undervalued, and these are dramatically overvalued. And then DeepSeek comes along and says, we can do this for less. The fastest 0 to $1 billion retailer was Old Navy, and the value proposition is probably the business model that gets a company to scale faster than any companies in history, and that is 80% of the gap for 50% of the price. Southwest was 80% of Delta or American for 50% of the price. That's a really outstanding value proposition, and I think that's why DeepSeek is going to be a name you're going to hear more of. In addition, all of these models are beginning to hit technical parity, and that is they immediately deploy their own AI to try and reverse engineer any technical superiority in another LLM and then reverse engineer it into their own company. It's almost impossible now to maintain any sort of underlying technological advantage. I love the idea that the first person that AI is putting out of work is AI. Okay, so what happens here? One of my big theses is that who's on the right side of this trade? Who's going to benefit? We have a tendency to think that every technology can be sequestered, the value to a small number of companies who then reap trillions of dollars in shareholder value. But what we forget is that doesn't always happen. So for example, I would argue that maybe with the exception of the American middle class, that probably the best innovation or most dramatic innovation in history is vaccines. Literally saves tens of millions of lives every year. And if you don't believe that, you're fucked up in the head. Stop watching Fox. In the same time, the company that's probably the most innovative or aggressive around vaccines, Moderna, has lost 90% of its market cap because it's been very hard to sequester the IP around vaccines and capture that value. I think, for me, the greatest breakthrough in technology is that in the next 7 days, I'll be in 7 cities. And I can do that because I'll skirt along the surface of the atmosphere at 8/10 the speed of sound and get there safely in what is the safest form of transportation ever. And that's only happened in the last 30 or 40 years. My parents came here from Glasgow and London, respectively, and they had to crawl across the Atlantic for 7 or 9 days on a steamship and spend about 4 months' salary, or if their earnings, just to get one way here, right? Go even further back, when people were trying to get across the US, it didn't take 5 or 6 hours, in a pod with peanuts and Makers and ginger ale. They, got stuck in a storm over the Rockies and started eating each other. If you took all of the profits and losses from the entire airline industry, the manufacturers, the airlines, right, all of them, As of this year, they're break even. Because these companies were never able to figure out a way to create capital moats with IP or distribution or brand that gave them the margin that anyway reflected the breakthrough in innovation. Or put another way, sometimes technologies, the big winner is all of us. That we get to take vaccines and vaccinate our children for very low cost. We get to travel to Europe for about $450 or just a couple days salary by the average American household. Or we can essentially get a supercomputer on our desk that would have cost $30 million 20 years before for $400 from Dell. Think about the amount of productivity. Imagine your life without PCs, right? Basically, your iPhone is a PC. And yet, other than Apple, remember all these computer companies? I bought 17% of Gateway Computer in 2006 and went on the board. I realize that's the weakest flex in the world. We were the second largest computer manufacturer in the world. We produced 3 times more computers than Apple, much lower margins. And we were lucky to sell. We sold for $700 million a year after I went on the board. Google will lose or gain $700 million about every 30 seconds in an average trading day. Unbelievable technologies, unbelievable impact on society. We were the winners. No small number of companies were able to sequester that value. The reason I bring this up, I think that might be true of AI. I think the big winners might be us, and there won't be a small number of companies that are able to ring fence it and create trillions of dollars in shareholder value. I'm going to skip to the end. There's huge fears around AI. It becomes sentient and kills us. I'm not a philosopher, but I think there's always a kill switch. There's always some weirdo behind or in front of the technology. I also don't think that AI couldn't be used as effectively as a defensive measure versus an offensive measure. It creates new opportunities for cyber attacks, but it should create new opportunities for cyber defense. Job destruction, generally speaking, every technology, there's job destruction in the short and the medium term, but then over time, it creates additional margin and new jobs. Everybody thought automation was going to decimate labor in the automotive industry, but we didn't anticipate heated seats or car stereos, and now there's more people employed in the global auto industry than there was before automation. We wanted to destroy weaving machines, the Luddites, because it was the largest employer of women in Great Britain, and then we figured out, oh, it's actually better when you bring down the cost of apparel. The cost of apparel on an inflation-adjusted basis have dropped 60%, and yet retail is still, the employment in the retail industry has been flat to up. We always get scared. We do see a dip in employment. The fear here is that the V down will be more severe, and America is not very good at taking care of people who are on the wrong end of these trades. We spend 0.2% of our GDP on retraining and vocational training versus like a Denmark that spends 2% on retraining people. We're very much more like the Hunger Games. Okay, so what to do? All of you should have a second screen, and everything you do, try and think, what could AI do? How could I use AI? When I get anything digital, I upload it to AI and say, interpret this for me and what are actionable items. I'm at that point where I have more money than time now. I'm freaked out about my health. I want to live to be 100. I'm not sure why. And then, so I upload, I get all my blood taken and all my blood work done like every month, right? And I always upload it into AI and say, what can I do to live longer? What should I do? It always says, stop drinking, you fucking idiot. Worth it. I'll go with a smile on my face. I've got more out of alcohol than it's got out of me. I'm a much better version of me, a little bit fucked up. Anyways. The people who own the client relationship, you got to get into the office. The 2 worst things that happen to young people are 1, remote work. You're 38% more likely to be laid off if you're remote. When people are putting together a list of who they lay off, it's super easy to lay off people you don't know. It's much more easy to promote the person. Promotions, generally speaking, the decider has 3 people who are qualified for a promotion. And he or she will pick a person based on who they have the strongest relationship with, and relationships are a function of proximity. If you're young, get into the office before you start collecting dogs and kids. The office is a feature, not a bug. Also, and HR managers don't like this, 1 in 3 relationships begin at work, and 99.9% of those relationships are consensual. So the idea that you're not going into work is going to make you less wealthy and less opportunities romantically. True story. I've been to 11 weddings of people who worked in my companies. I'm like, they were fucking? And by the way, nothing pisses me off more than an HR manager trying to discourage relationships who's on his or her third divorce. Meet out, start drinking, start fucking, get on it. The core competence is storytelling, it always will be. Your ability to craft a narrative with data and compel people to action. It's not computer science, it's not Mandarin, who knows? But it is, I think storytelling is the enduring technology. Take every opportunity to learn how to write well, learn your medium and social media, try and weaponize communications. Always take the opportunity to speak in front of people such that you get at least to an acceptable level. This is the ultimate competence. If you want to score above your weight class professionally, economically, and romantically, just get a good rap. That is everything. Okay. I believe the greatest threat of AI is something we don't talk a lot about, and it's something I think a lot about because I'm very focused on the struggles of young men. I think the greatest threat of AI, simply put, is loneliness. So, men age 20 to 30 are spending less time outdoors than prison inmates. The number of teenagers who see their friends every day has been cut in half just in the last 10 years, and the deepest pocketed, most talented companies in the world have one mission, and that is to convince people, especially young men who have a much more immature prefrontal cortices, the gas on, gas off executive function, trying to convince them they can have a reasonable facsimile of life online. Why go through the pecking order of trying to establish friendships when you have Reddit and Discord? Why go through the bullshit of navigating the corporate world and putting on a tie and putting up with bosses that are dumb when you can make money trading stocks or crypto on Coinbase or Robinhood? And why on earth would you go through the hassle, the rejection, the self-esteem destroying process of trying to establish a kindness practice, demonstrate excellence, following up, have perseverance, showering for God's sakes, to try and establish a romantic and a sexual partnership when you literally have lifelike synthetic porn available on every device 24/7. It's as if we have decided to try and evolve a new species of asocial, asexual males. Big tech is not our friend. They have attached a profit motive into planning our own extinction. So my net and my advice to young people, somewhat snarkily, is the following. Get out, drink more, make a series of bad decisions that might pay off. One in 4 men can't name a best friend. 1 in 7 men can't name a single friend. If you go into a morgue, here's a depressing stat. If you go into a morgue and there's 5 people who died by suicide, 4 are men. Men are especially susceptible to the dopa offer and, quite frankly, the sequestering from relationships than women are. And there's this myth, this cartoon of a woman in her 30s who tragically never found romantic love, and she's alone listening to Joan Baez and staring out in her wool sweater, staring out into a rainy afternoon with the only thing that love her are these cats. The reality is, she's fine. It's dudes that need relationships. If a man hasn't cohabitated or married by the time he's 30, there's a 1 in 3 chance he is going to be a substance abuser. Widows are happier after their husband dies. True story. Widowers are less happy. Women in relationships do live longer. They live 2 to 4 years longer. Men in relationships live 4 to 7 years longer. Men need guardrails, specifically the guardrail of a romantic relationship, and if they don't have one, they come off the tracks. So what do we do about it? If you were to reverse engineer to the single point of failure in a boy's life, boys are struggling on every single dimension. They are not doing as well as young girls. And unfortunately, there's a lack of empathy because my generation of white heterosexual males registered so much unfair prosperity that we're now holding 19-year-olds liable for that. Empathy is not a zero-sum game. We can still recognize the huge challenge non-whites and women still face while recognizing young men are really struggling. Civil rights did not hurt white people. Gay marriage did not hurt heteronormative marriage. Focusing on and recognizing the problems of young men is not going to hurt women. You know who wants more economically and emotionally viable men? Women. Men mate socioeconomically horizontally and up, women horizontally and down. And when the pool of horizontal and up, pool of mates keeps decreasing, there's a lack of household formation. 40 years ago, 60% of households had one child. Now it's 27%. Is it because young people don't want kids? No, it's because women can't find economically or emotionally viable mates. And also, we keep electing the land of the dead and the golden girls to Congress who keep voting old people more money. I'm almost done here. The average 70-year-old is 72% wealthier than they were 40 years ago. The average person under the age of 40 is 24% less wealthy. Oh, but they're entitled? No, they're entitled to be enraged. We need to stop this bullshit. We need to start putting more money in the hands of young people. The $40 billion tax credit for children gets stripped out of the infrastructure bill, but the $120 billion a year cost of living adjustment for Social Security, for the recipients of which are the wealthiest generation in the history of the planet, flies right through Congress. The best thing that could happen for young men right now is if we were to pass universal child care. Why? The zone of suicide for men is greatest a year after he gets divorced. He loses his primary relationship. Oftentimes he loses access to his kids. And why do people get divorced under the age of 40? Is it infidelity? No. Is it a lack of shared values? No. It's economic strain. Pretty fucking simple. We need to transfer money back from my generation to a younger generation. This is my second last slide. It's an emotionally manipulative slide meant to get you to like me more. That's me and my son at World Cup in Russia 8 years ago, applying to college this year. Okay. That's all I have. Thank you. Do we have time? Or
We've got maybe a couple of minutes. There's just
Okay.
a couple of
Sure.
things that have come in, maybe just to close it out,
Sure.
Scott. So this is actually an anonymous question that came in. It said, you started the presentation saying you're an AI optimist. This person says, after the presentation, I'm more nervous, scared, and depressed. What are you optimistic about?
So I don't think AI is going to go sentient and kill us. I don't think AI is going to destroy jobs. I think over the long term it'll create jobs. I think there's tremendous opportunities in healthcare. You think about the mother taking care of a child with diabetes, and let's be honest, it's always the mother. That mother has to spend 5 months of her year managing that child's diabetes. Between specialists, referrals, prescriptions, arguing with the insurance company, I believe there will be AI applications that give that mother 1 month, 2 months, 3 months back for self-care, making money. So I think AI in healthcare is going to be a breakthrough. I'm worried about the markets, but I think that this will add a lot of value. Also, some fine print, and I should have disclosed this. I see everything as a glass half full. Everyone gets up here and says, I'm an optimist. And okay, you need optimists so that you can fly a plane or invent a plane. You need pessimists for seatbelts. I'm a pessimist. I struggle with anger and depression, so I'm constantly have to remind myself what could go right. And the people who are optimists tend to do better over the long term in the market because the trajectory of the market over the long term because of demographics and innovation is up and to the right. So I say that saying, yeah, this guy's dark and maybe we should ask ourselves what could go right. But I am guilty of basically seeing things through a dark colored lens. Good news is I hate my life less and less every day.
That is all we have time for. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott.
Thank
Galloway.
you. Thanks, brother. Thanks, man. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go to our final break now. Just one piece of